All right. Josh, Andy, thank you for joining me. Josh, it's been a long time since we got to do one of these on stage. Last time we did this, I remember the clip so vividly. It was the beep, beep. It was the Silicon Valley Bank collab.
Ooh.
Yes, which was a
fun one.
Quite a year to have the event. It was like months after. So glad we're doing this now. And your roles have evolved since that time that we talked last. So first, kind of before we jump in, I want to set the stage a little bit. We have kind of investor operator transitions represented on stage. Josh, very successful operator career with Auris Health, Endogastric Solutions, et cetera. Now running Mendaera. You've had one of the largest exits in medtech, history. Why jump back into the operator seat? Why not be an investor? It looks so much fun.
It is fun. I think it is romanticized, though. So for any of the investors in the room or audiences following along at home, it's challenging. I think both investor and entrepreneur have a relationship that is unique, and that there's some understanding of one another's worlds, but not complete understanding of one another's worlds. So I have a lot of respect for investors. I think the challenge there is that they're judged over a much longer time horizon. You don't necessarily have the same level of control. And at the end of the day, I am a builder. So there's something that I really felt passionate about doing, maintaining a relationship with Lux. So maybe I'll go back to investing someday. But for now, back to operating.
Yeah. What about you, Andy? Would you go back to investing? Do you miss it?
Yeah, there's certainly things that I miss and some things that I don't. I think there's, no matter which side of the table you're on, you're still raising money. And that's not any easier to get money from an LP than it is to get from a VC. So I think it's just kind of pick your poison on which battles you want to choose. I think one of the things, in addition to the learning cycles, is when you're in an operator role, the ups are up and the downs are down. When you're an investor and have a portfolio, there's always ups and always downs. So it's a very different experience.
Yeah. I think the exciting thing now is we get you both in the thick of operating two extremely unique businesses with some commonalities and common threads that we'll draw on. So to start here, kind of focused on the robotics aspects of your companies and the technology side, can you both just quickly explain, what your robot is so we can see it in our mind? And Josh, we'll start with you.
Yes, you'll hear from Andy in a moment, but essentially, my robot is a small handheld collaborative robotic device. We make custom software that integrates with imaging, specifically ultrasound. And what the system is designed to do is enable all healthcare providers to be able to perform consistent needle-based procedures. And really, where that starts is in things like vascular access biopsy. So I don't want to steal any of Andy's thunder. It's like the things that it's everything but what Andy and his team do, hopefully. So,
yeah, I think we both use needles at some level, but that's about it. So I'm here on behalf of Vitestro, and Vitestro is an autonomous blood drawing robot. So it's really focused on putting the needle in the center of the vein and getting the blood out. And the way that looks is something very different. It's basically a console about 5 feet by 2 feet by 5 feet tall. Patient sits down, puts their arm in, presses a button, does everything from finding the vein, drawing the blood, filling the vials, inverting the vial, which is a big problem with the existing status quo, and then puts a Band-Aid on. So it's really doing everything that you can imagine a phlebotomist does today.
So the robotics that you're talking about here sound very different than what I think of when I think of robotics in healthcare historically. I think of large format surgical robotics. I think of orthopedic surgery, these kind of high complexity procedures where the value proposition of robotics is precision and things of that nature. Talk a little bit about why you're applying robotics to these, different aspects of healthcare and how you think about the value and the opportunity there. Andy?
Yeah, I think if you look at what Intuitive's doing and relative to phlebotomy, where there's billions of blood draws a year, the scale of the volume is so different. The trade-off there also being the value per procedure is very different. So I think when you look at robotics outside of healthcare, and I'll let Josh address that as well, I think it's a lot of repetitive, mundane tasks that are automated frequently. And I think when you look in healthcare, there is no more repetitive and common repetitive task as drawing blood. And so I think that's where we really took that approach of, and this was the original Sonder thesis, of saying, okay, within healthcare and robotics applications, how can you start moving down that per value or per procedure value pyramid, and at the same time move up in the volume of the procedure in general. And so we started with that with Neptune Medical, another portfolio of a company of ours, which is robotic GI endoscopy. That starts moving that path. And then we started looking at other more common procedures like phlebotomy. Here we are.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty similar inspiration for us. Oftentimes when you think of robotics, you think of more complex systems. And then because they're big and they're complex, they have a certain cost threshold. And so we do, as innovators, what anybody in medtech does who's worth their salt, which is, okay, well, if it's going to cost me this much money, how can I work within the reimbursement, the unmet clinical needs? And what happens is you, generally speaking, move further up the healthcare interventional food chain. And the inverse problem to that is if you are targeting a subset of operating rooms, it's actually really hard to build these businesses from a supply chain perspective. When you plan your go-to-market, you're going to place 3 robots in the first year, maybe 10 in the second, like no suppliers getting out of bed for that. So I think from our perspective, the challenge that we posed to ourselves was, how do you make healthcare robotics look more like they do in warehousing and manufacturing? And so my co-founder is a PhD roboticist. We actually didn't know that we were going to be in healthcare in the beginning. We stepped back, and there's globally about 500,000 robots shipped per year. Intuitive Surgical, who is an incredible company, I think has 10,000 active robots. I don't know how many they sold over time, but I think that's what they advertise. And so that's like a fraction of what's going on in the world of robotics outside of healthcare. And so we began this search to say, like, where you were talking about the dull, the dirty, the dangerous, where in healthcare do you have a wild imbalance of demand and supply and efficiency? And how do you make robots fix that problem? And so that's how we landed to some extent on the needle-based procedures set as well, as we realized that, generally speaking, you're not going to get cancer treatments without a biopsy. You're not going to get an endovascular procedure without great vascular access. You're not going to have orthopedic procedures without injections, right? And at the end of the day, when we looked at the available claims data for these things, about 90% of the hundreds of millions of procedures that are performed are done by 10% of healthcare providers. The number is woeful. And so we just said, hey, that's a problem that we can really sink our teeth into and hopefully democratize something with a simpler robot.
You mentioned...
Can I pick up a thread on that too? Because I think so much of medtech is about the per procedure reimbursement and how do you fit into that paradigm. And I think so I'm now on the operator side pitching to investors, and that's always a question. Well, what's the CPT code for having your blood drawn? Actually, that's completely irrelevant to our business model. It's not a piece of the puzzle. And so I think when you start looking at other areas of the hospital where automation makes sense, where robotics makes sense, it also... you have to start thinking about the business model and the economic argument very differently. And frankly, I think that's something that a lot of medtech investors have a hard time wrapping their head around.
Yeah, you talk about the types of robots that exist outside of healthcare, looking at that as a guiding post for how to apply them to different areas of healthcare. Talk about the build of your system for a moment. Do you take inspiration from the types of robotics that are out there in terms of the architecture, then the way that they look and the way that they perform, the types of technologies that you're using to augment those robotics? How do you think about what exists and applying it to your business?
Yeah, I can dive in on that. I think for our setup, right, if you think of a traditional hospital outpatient phlebotomy suite, you're constrained roughly to a 12 by 12, 10 by 10 kind of setup. And so that was one of our core criteria, is how do you fit into that from a real estate perspective? I think one of the, also evolutionary things that came out of this was looking at it not just from what does the end result look, but we really went back and forth with hospitals to refine what are the needs of that. And also with patients, because I think it's a very personal interaction. And like a lot of things, patients are conscious; they're actually interacting with the device, and so that was also something that we took a lot of inspiration into. Is nobody really wants to stick their arm in a black box to have a needle poke them, but how can you make it open, accessible? And I think we just released our brand name of Aletta, which is really about Dr. Aletta Jacobs, bringing it back to a personal, a companion rather than a robot. So that was very important as we thought about how we designed the product.
I mean, in terms of where we got the inspiration and the architecture from, I wouldn't say that we looked at existing designs, but it was more the case that if you define what a robot is pretty broadly, like a Roomba is a robot, right? So they don't have to be humanoid robots. They don't have to be forearm laparoscopic robotic systems. And so we, on a first principles basis, we're really dealing with that same sort of economic equation that Andy was talking to. Everybody's going to say to you, what's the CPT code for this? What's the CP code for that? And as you move, I'm going to call it down the food chain, do higher volume procedures, they don't reimburse as much. So we knew that we had to make an architecture that was super cost effective, that delivered value for people. And so as a result, our architecture doesn't look like anything you would expect. Our robot is about 180 grams, which is about the weight of your iPhone or your Android device. And it clicks onto an ultrasound and then really just acts as an image stabilizer around someone's hand. So ours looks very dissimilar from what I think people would think of as like an iconic robot.
You bring up the Roomba as an example of like a consumer robot, right? Non-humanoid. It's not this like crazy futuristic thing. One of our mutual friends at the event, his son tells me, or he told me that his son thinks the Roomba is alive. Thinks it's like a dog. He rides it around. He takes care of it. He takes it to the park so much they had to get him a second Roomba, so he'd leave the regular Roomba alone. And the reason I bring that up is because different types of people probably interact with these robots very differently. We're used to, the highest end bariatric surgeon interacting with the Da Vinci. We're not so used to what robotics look like in phlebotomy or, in other areas. And so how do you think about what's the response been from, providers that maybe haven't been as seasoned or trained on, robotics? All of a sudden you inject this technology into their workflow.
Yeah, I'll jump in. It's a very interesting paradigm that we operate in is very different. If you think of a surgical robot where a surgeon is ultimately driving that, with our device, it's essentially autonomous. And so we're really trying to de-skill this to the extreme because that's how it works to come back to the economics. And so when we thought about how is a user going to use this, our main users that we were thinking about was really the patient and the phlebotomist. And the clinical KOLs that you'd normally think about driving the development of the device weren't really as insightful into what the needs of the phlebotomist and the patients are. So I think that really, I guess I'm still going to wait for my pet Roomba, but I think we really thought about it from a consumer perspective. How could the patient and the user end up being comfortable with that?
Yeah, I mean, it's super similar. So if you have a robot that's more commonly used, I think it has to be even more approachable. I think a lot of people in robotics, and I've heard this like pretty classically when you're talking to people, like, oh, the first version is going to have workflow challenges, and they'll point back to something Intuitive did like 30 years ago. Like the first prostatectomy took 15 hours. Like, sorry, but that was 30 years ago, and I don't think that the expectation is that's okay anymore, right? Yeah. So I think that the market has been conditioned to see what like excellence looks like. And so you have to ask yourself, when you inject a robot into a workflow, you own all of the workflow. Mm-hmm. And so, on a first principles basis is like, how do you make it just work? Mm-hmm. It sounds really kind of trite to say that, but it needs to. iPhones wouldn't be as successful as they were if they didn't just work. AirPods probably wouldn't sell as many, although mine don't connect all the time. But there's something about that user experience that I think is really special. So if you're going to try to enhance somebody in some way, I reject the premise that there's a trade-off that has to be made. And of course, there's some trade-off around the edges, but if it's big existential stuff, like I just don't think it's going to work.
Yeah, maybe building on that too. I think looking at Neptune Medical, which I mentioned previously, I remember in their pitch deck, they had one of my colleagues' 5-year-old sons driving the robot, because that's how intuitive it was. And I think as you start moving to these higher volume things, you don't want something that's, a high burden just to operate.
Right. The thing, Josh, you said earlier about where your robots play, right? You're playing in phlebotomy, you're playing in biopsy and adjacent procedures. Sounds like you guys have covered everything.
We're friends.
Yeah, there you go. Seems like it. But it sounds like you guys have covered everything, right? That's all the unmet needs. We've covered it all. We've got Intuitive. Now we've got these two robots. We got Vitestro. We got Mendaera.
We're done, sir.
We're done, right?
We're done.
Can you talk about from your needs finding process that you did when you started Mendaera, which was an interesting process? Tell me, did you find a couple of other inefficiencies you could have gone after? Are there, one or two, or are there orders of magnitude more?
I think there are millions is probably a little hyperbolic. There are tens of, if not hundreds of opportunities for robotics in care delivery. If you just want to focus on the hospital setting, people will always talk about how much, I have a technology, it's more efficient. I'm making the operating room more efficient, right? Whatever the dollar amount is, I don't even know off the top of my head anymore. But like a hard fact that is true, we spend $1.2 trillion in hospital-based spending in the United States. There's about 6,000 hospitals, right? They don't all do surgeries. The average hospital's operational expenditure is $200 million. And the average percentage of that, which is labor, is about 2/3. It's called $140 million. If you divide that by 500,000 minutes a year, which is about how many there are. The hospital spends $225 a minute on labor. So whenever you see people sitting around, screwing around, wasting time with something, like that is an opportunity. It doesn't always have to be, I'm going to go change the world and, do remote thrombectomy. That's a novel and noble thing. I'm going to cure cancer. Like, care delivery in this country sucks. Being a patient in a hospital sucks. And we always tell people, like, that is all that should suck. Receiving care should not suck. And so whether it's like moving materials from the shipping dock up to sterile supply, whether it's automating, central sterile supply, like there's a million things you could do. And it doesn't have to be, this gets reimbursed $60,000 and we're going to make a mint here. I think you can make a mint by doing really well and delivering simpler robots that are task specific to do just kick-ass jobs and solve unmet needs, frankly. But
yeah, and I think there's one thing that was new to me as I dove into the world of the laboratory side of the hospital is if you look at what happens is, for example, after a blood sample is taken, it's actually extremely automated. No human touches it. From the minute that blood is put on a conveyor belt until the results are spit back to the patient, most of those samples don't have anybody touching that. And so I think it's interesting when I look at where there are opportunities for automation, there's some interesting ways, even in the hospital, to look for inspiration that aren't surgical robotics. And I think, I think also the other trend here of robotics and I guess kind of delivery of care, if you look at like Forward Health, I know, that unfortunate outcome there, but I think you start looking at things where it is bringing technology closer to the patient. We already have a staff shortage. You're going to have to automate and have to have robotics as a part of those solutions, I believe.
With your robotics being one piece, obviously, over time, the generality of robotics has been kind of more pervasive in healthcare. It's no longer the kind of maybe as shiny piece of technology at the moment, but AI, autonomy, really the technologies of the moment. And if we look at where healthcare is today with those technologies versus what's happening outside of healthcare in self-driving, for example, I'd say that healthcare isn't exactly the fastest moving of the AI adoption areas. When you think about actually delivering real value with autonomy, AI, computer vision, et cetera, how are you sourcing talent? Where's your talent coming from? How are you building your teams? Are these people coming from bona fide medtech strategics, other robotics companies that have operated in, more of the traditional format outside of the healthcare?
There's a lot to unpack there. So the first part, the AI piece, I'm super excited about what machine learning, artificial intelligence can do in healthcare. I'd say the structural disadvantage, and if anybody in the audience has a solution for this, I would love to talk to you afterwards. Like if you're designing or developing autonomous big rigs or cars, like you can plunk somebody in a car and go and generate massive unique data sets. It is really hard to get massive multimodal data sets in healthcare that include all of your radiological imaging, all of your H&P, your unstructured data, your genetic. It doesn't exist. And so the thing I beat my head on a wall against every single time I've been involved with a connected medical technology is like, where do you get the data? And somebody's always got like, it's corny, a DVD of like, I got these 600 patients. It's like, that is not data at scale. So I think that there's like a structural challenge for AI there, which leads to the second point, which is it is actually tougher, in my opinion, to recruit people in AI, in particular in the world of robotics, particularly as you've seen like all the humanoid robots outside of healthcare garner so much interest and investment. I mean, there's just massive companies out there making laundry folding robots, and we actually compete against that. We don't necessarily see ourselves competing for talent like from another med tech company necessarily. I kind of feel like we're all in it together. It's like I worry about flight of intelligence in healthcare. That's really frightening. So we do manage to recruit people. We do pull people who are like very mission oriented from those tech companies. But it's definitely not an easy lift. I mean, I think recruiting is one of the most difficult things.
Yeah, I think, I mean, if I look at Figure AI, it's like a $29-30 billion valuation, and I think they maybe have a contract or two. So, I mean, we don't see those kinds of things in healthcare. And so I think, when you
too bad
to get, that's right. Maybe next year, right?
Yeah.
But I think, that does pose a disadvantage to us. I think Vitestro specifically is a little bit of an exception. It's a Dutch company, so pretty much every engineer we have is based there in the Netherlands, and actually has very good engineers. So we're first for, and I would say compounded with that, we're not competing with Bay Area AI companies. So I think that's provided a great advantage for us. But fairly unique to the situation. If I look at other companies in our portfolio, in Saunders' portfolio, it's the same situation. I mean, you're having to compete in a very difficult labor pool with the buzz that's going on there.
You're talking about the idea of these companies outside of healthcare raising these massive rounds at these massive valuations. And there are some, tremendous outcomes in B2B SaaS and high tech and whatnot. Obviously, your companies can't be playing for the traditional med tech exit. You've taken 90 million in capital. How much?
Yeah, 99.
99, and your company just announced
We've had 50 in total.
Right, large round. So if you just look at the simple math here, the $300 million exit probably doesn't move the needle for the investors, and that can't be why they're doing the deal. How do you think about your, where you're going with this company? What's the exit horizon? Where do you think it can be, and how big can it be?
Go for it.
I'm on the record for this.
Yeah. I mean, so I have a very contrarian view of this, and I think it is almost as hard to make and build a $10 million company as it is a $10 billion company. It's just, you're going to have setbacks. You're going to make wrong decisions that you need to learn from and correct quickly. And so my attitude has always been changing healthcare is hard because of the multi-sided stakeholder dynamics you deal with, regulatory, who's the buyer, who's the user, who's the recipient. Like there's a lot of complexity there. And it has always really been difficult for me. My first two startups were definitely the investor syndicate was much more traditional med tech. We would be funded milestone to milestone. And I felt like 80% of our effort was fundraising and operating the company. And so I've taken a viewpoint. It's like, you got to try to find people who are going to help you fund through 2 or 3 milestones. You got to stay super engaged with them. You got to be disciplined. You got to execute your ass off. But you should be trying to build the biggest, boldest, most ambitious thing you can. And so, aspirationally, I don't know what'll happen, and I'm going to be humble about it. Like, we're trying to build Mendaera as a standalone, self-sustaining company that can scale and create a ton of value and hopefully go public. But I think you have to have that mentality from the start, and I think you got to find people who are aligned to that vision and are going to be willing to kind of wade through the muck with you, particularly the muck that is the healthcare ecosystem.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think so starting with Vitestro, definitely an opportunity that we see to take this public, be a durable public company with plenty of opportunities in the product portfolio to expand out from where we're established now. But I think the challenge is, very much so in medtech, everybody's doing the math on a $300 to $500 million exit, saying, well, that's what most successful outcomes are going to be. And that ends up kind of rethinking how you approach your capital partners and how you're funding the company and what you're funding for. And so making sure that you're aligned is going to be a very important part. And sometimes that's not the traditional folks that we see, floating around the halls here sometimes. So.
Yeah. And I mean, one other thing, I'll acknowledge that is very much how the ecosystem is, right? In healthcare, you've got a limited pool of strategic acquirers.
Correct.
It is a super important innovation engine. So it's not to knock it. I think it is just as hard, though, to build a $100 million or get a $200 million outcome as it is to try to swing for the fences. And so you just, if that is one's orientation, which in robotics, I think it largely has to be robotics. I mean, Andy, you guys are 50 in, we're 99 in. And we've got a little ways to go. Like, we will probably raise, God willing, another $50 to $100 million. That's just an impedance mismatch, as you're pointing out. With if you raise 100 and you're only getting 3 to 5, no one's really playing for a 3 to 5x.
Yeah.
So pick your poison.
Yeah. Enough. I think that one of the things where I'm interested in to kind of see how it plays out, but it's really exciting to see, smaller M&A revive this year. There's a lot of momentum, and we see the large strategics buying things earlier, hopefully, a little bit before. It may not be kind of the kind of off clinical data like it was at one time, but it isn't just, the Shockwave size M&A anymore, which feels good. At the same time, when you look at the Shockwaves and the Inaris and those things kind of come off the board and get tucked in, you talk about that consolidated set of strategic acquirers. I question if it's good for the health of the ecosystem long term. If you think about a company like Wiz, for example, that got acquired by Google, there's a lot of companies that can buy, and that company can be massive and buy its own companies. And do you think that, how do you think about that for the health of the ecosystem? And hopefully, selfishly, you guys are thinking about becoming companies that can acquire other companies and continue to power that flywheel.
Yeah, I think consolidation is a big challenge in our industry for this perspective. It's not just necessarily an economic perspective, but I think if you can have successful outcomes, you can have little in, moderate out, you can have big in, big out. But I think when I think of, if I combine a few different data points here, if you look at that period from regulatory approval to actually getting your reimbursement, how long that takes, I mean, that's a huge barrier. That's where strategics actually can fund something through. And when you have consolidation, if you start thinking about just what are the incentives, you have an incentive to wait to buy something. I mean, if there's no competition, why take it out at whatever the data is here? You always will get more de-risked as time goes on. And so there's really a mismatch of incentives there. And I think that, poses a threat to innovative, impactful technologies actually getting out to patients, because they might die on the vine without a healthy ecosystem of funders and the acquirers, which are going to be that, virtuous cycle you got to build up.
I mean, Andy covered it pretty well. I mean,
Oh, nothing? Come on.
I got nothing.
Well, I got one for you then to maybe, let's see. So you, Josh and Andy, both maintain relationships with pretty prominent venture funds, both inside our space and out. Lux Capital, Sonder Capital. You guys have proven operating careers. Now you're having these companies with these huge visions, incredible technology, going after massive problems. It must be super easy for you guys to raise capital.
Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah. Next question.
Tell me what it's been like raising capital for something like this that's, counter narrative, complex, et cetera.
Yeah. So I think, it comes back. You and I talk about this a lot. So we have healthcare investors who invest in Mendaera, but they, generally speaking, are general technology funds that a subset of what they do is healthcare. They generally are managing more money, and they generally look at sort of what is the return that's needed and what is the opportunity for the capital going in here. And it's, frankly, I think this is my view of it, they're diversifying into healthcare versus somebody who's only in healthcare. Raising money from them has been, relatively speaking, more straightforward than in the healthcare environment. One of the challenges that we get in the healthcare environment, to be really frank, is my indication for use for my product is precise instrument placement with real-time imaging. The next question I get from someone is like, what is the one procedure you're going to start with? And I go, well, it doesn't really work that way, because when a urologist picks it up, urologists put needles in the body for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And they'll go, well, do you have your preclinical animal data on X and Y? And you're like, no, the problem is, of the procedures that the urologist does today, 70% of the time, someone else helps them with it. I now enable this person to do it themselves. They love it. They're excited. They're going to do it. And they go, how do you know? I'm like, well, when we get the money, we will finish the development of the product and show you. So, these are real conversations, and it's super hard. I mean, seeds and A's, I think, relatively speaking, more straightforward, never easy. B is really, really hard. So when we raised our B, we were just finishing development. We had not submitted to the FDA. We had preclinical data, and everyone's like, wait and see attitude.
Yeah.
So it really is finding that person who believes in the vision. That's that first domino that falls over, who's like, I get the vision. I'm in. I see that there's risk. I'm willing to assume that risk because I don't want to pay the price later. And when that person does it, good things happen. But it is through a boatload of effort. I mean, it probably took us 12 months to sort of make that happen.
B.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, I agree. I think the B is a very difficult round to raise. And I think, I guess, a couple pieces to build on that. I think to be appealing to the more general investors, I think you have to have those bigger stories, because that's also what they're looking for, generally speaking, is not these, iterative couple $100 million exits for them. They're managing massive pools of capital, and they're going to need something big to move the needle for their fund size. So I think that's an important thing. And then I think for the B, I'm now on the other side of the table. And yeah, the B is a difficult one. Our experience has been is most medtech growth investors need the check boxes. They need the regulatory, they need the US commercial traction. And then, especially when you're looking at capital intensive companies like robotics, we're probably too late, so to speak, for the early investors. So it's an interesting kind of chasm that you're in, right, in that Series B. You need, and it's, we'll see.
And well, with the last minute here, I want to ask you guys, when we see you again, this time next year, where will Mendaera be? Where will Vitestro be?
Yeah, so we're pending FDA clearance now. Feel good about it. Don't know for sure. Hopefully we are cleared on the market. Our main objectives for our initial release is that people use the product, love the product, and that the clinical, operational, and economic benefits are what we expect that they are. So hopefully this time next year, we're sort of emerging from our initial market release and starting to scale up.
Yeah, and I think for us, we're doing a lot of the U.S. market development right now. We're a little bit, probably 6 to 12 months behind where you are in terms of the U.S. side of things. But on the European side, as a Dutch company, we're already CE marked, and so we'll really be focused on developing some centers of excellence over there, translating those learnings to our clinical partners here in the U.S.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much. I look forward to seeing you again when all those things are true, and then we can talk again about all the challenges you're facing.
Yeah. Thanks to you,
That's right.
Scott, Kelly, the whole team.
Yeah,
Great conference.
absolutely.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah,
Guys.
thank you.